Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss secondary data analysis. This lecture is a part of your paper Communications Research. Desk-based research is absolutely guided by secondary data resources. This kind of data is collected by other researchers at another point of time. Primary researchers uses it for own purpose, which guides him or her in developing a clear idea about research problem and to find out some other research questions to study. In the words of Hakim, 1982, secondary data analysis is any further analysis of survey or social data set that presents interpretation, conclusion or knowledge in addition to or different from that presented in the primary research as an inquiry into a whole or main research. Besides, it gives an excellent opportunity to gather knowledge from different scholars around the world. In this lecture, we will learn specifically about secondary data analysis procedure, their resources and uses in detail. Some authors prefers to include both written and oral documents as evidence for their research. Research institutes, government database, surveys are the rich source of secondary data. These existing databases are very helpful to serve other research purposes, saving time, money and human resources for repeated collection of massive data again. Rationale behind conducting secondary data analysis. Encyclopedia of Measurement and Statistics enlisted for important practical reasons for utilizing secondary data source. So let us discuss those. Secondary data are easily available and one of the cheapest means of collecting data. While there is no or less research funding, secondary data is very cost efficient and reliable means of conducting research. Rationale behind conducting secondary data analysis. Secondary source of data helps in building confidence while the same result gathered from several sources. So, triangulation can be achieved in communication research by using secondary source of data efficiently. In case of historical research, textual content gathered from newspapers, reports, letters, gazette and other source of qualitative data is very useful. Rationale behind conducting secondary data analysis. It helps in meeting special research needs of the researcher. For example, a researcher could study crime rate by accessing statistics from the site of National Crime Record Bureau, India. Finally, for young researchers, secondary source of data is very helpful. It helps them in their learning phase. Kotai and Thompson in 2012 identified major 6 approaches to secondary data analysis. By taking into account the anticipation of primary data creator and secondary users' experience. Let us discuss them in detail one by one. Approaches to secondary data analysis. Description, individual users, organizations as well as institutes are keen to use secondary data in a descriptive manner. Such descriptions have historic attitude towards data analysis. Transcribed interviews with selective samples of population can complement official sources of information like newspaper reports and public documents given in 2008. Altogether, these reanalyzed data become an important source for historical research. So, methods of secondary analysis can be recognized as synonyms of historical research. Comparison, reanalyze or follow-up research quantitative data is very useful to make comparison in case of diachronic studies. For example, NSS, NFHS survey data kept as public record to analyze population dynamics in case of further studies. By comparing data, rate of progress or regress can be analyzed, which gives a further scope to improve, especially in case of policy research studies. Reanalysis. Reanalysis of rich research materials gives altogether different kind of interpretation and diverse view. It benefits both primary and secondary researcher to develop a discourse as well as cross-check across time and space. Archived data can be scrutinized with scientific rigor to support or challenge methods and arguments proposed in primary study. Kotai and Thompson 2012 quoted this. Ravel says a research report is not merely an interpretation of data, but also a presentation of literary and social construct. Approaches to secondary data analysis, teaching and learning. There are several programs in social sciences in which research studies are mainly based on analysis of secondary source data. In these programs, teaching learning process is strengthened by analyzing interpretation of secondary data. Secondary data could be of two types, quantitative or qualitative data. Each type of data has its own method of analysis and drawbacks. Secondary analysis of quantitative data follows similar steps to analyze as that of traditional research, only vary in data collection procedure. Let us now discuss an example of using statistical data for secondary research. Through that, you will learn how to use existing data and use it further in communication research. Sample of secondary quantitative data analysis. International large-scale assessments are now part of the educational landscape in many countries and often feed into major policy decisions. Yet, such assessments also provide data sets for secondary analysis that can address key issues of concern to educators and policymakers alike. Traditionally, such secondary analysis use a variable-centered approach. In the study reported here, a person-centered analysis is used as an alternative to the traditional approach. Education study ICCS were analyzed to investigate Asian students' attitude to their future civic participation. Cluster analysis with validity measures showed that 4 distinct groups of students were identified within the societies studied, thus highlighting the diversity within the samples. Sample of secondary quantitative data analysis. These results cannot be achieved with a conventional variable approach to analysis, and they suggest the usefulness of exploring alternative approaches to secondary data analysis. Qualitative data is collected across various disciplines by applying various techniques and emphasizing the study needs. In communication research, data that could use from other primary sources are interviews, group of discussions, unstructured interviews, personal documents, and photographs. Although same steps need to follow that of quantitative secondary analysis, one more step need to add in case of qualitative secondary analysis. These data could be converted to various formats like video, audio, photograph, digital or handwritten diaries. So archived qualitative data are rich source of information that can be reanalyzed, reworked and compared with contemporary work. In last 25 years, most of the researchers in United States prefers to use secondary data for their qualitative research. Secondary data analysis has its own advantage, like researchers with limited technical expertise and training can analyze secondary data. However, one of the biggest challenges while using secondary data is to evaluate its quality. So before using any such data source for research, researcher must be concerned about certain steps. Set the objective of data collection. Before collection of data, researcher must set his objective of data collection. This will help him in locating which kind of data he is looking for and also from which source that could be drawn. Knowing the purpose of data collection will help to evaluate the quality of the data and discern the potential level of bias. Reliable source. Data should be gathered from a reliable source. While collection data, authenticity of the source, author's expertise and previous work must be taken into consideration. Inclusion of sound methodology. While using a study, being a researcher, one has to be concerned about the kind of methodology, appropriateness and sensibility used in the previous research. So, sound methodology based research work should be your focus. Publication date. The data or information you are going to use must be relevant and current one. In the era of globalization, society is changing rapidly, so an old data or information may not suffice your research need. For whom you are writing? Is your research study aimed for a particular reader or audience? If so, then your data must be specific and serious one to satisfy your readers. Is your source plagiarism free? The secondary researcher's data source must be plagiarism free. Inside the material, their source must be properly mentioned. Endnotes, footnotes, data source should be properly cited. This proves the authentication of the source. There are considerable ethical and methodological issues that a researcher must consider before using secondary data. Seven major difficulties identified by Cotai and Thompson in case of data reusing and sharing. These are ethical, consent, consideration, and constraints, representation, coverage, and research and fieldwork, unfamiliarity with the methods of secondary data analysis, lack of time to get fully acquainted with research materials. Lack of infrastructure for data sharing, misinterpretation of data, threat to intellectual property rights in data and methods. Let us now summarize what we discussed in the lecture. We learned about secondary source data analysis, their sources, procedure of analysis, uses and challenges to face while using them. Specifically, while conducting historical research, secondary source of data is very useful. In case of policy analysis, it works as an important source to evaluate, compare and further improvement. However, the researcher has to be careful regarding authentication of such sources. It should avoid any such misinterpretation of data. Do attempt the question in the self-evaluate quadrant. For further reading, suggestions, please refer to the third quadrant. Thank you.